The pre-dawn darkness clung to Blackwater Air Station like a heavy blanket, punctuated only by the rhythmic flash of red warning lights that dotted the runway's edge. The desert air carried a bite that would vanish with the first touch of sunrise. But for now it cut through the thin fabric of flight suits and maintenance coveralls with surgical precision. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's howl echoed across the vast expanse of Nevada scrubland, its voice swallowed almost immediately by the low rumble of turbine engines spinning up for the day's first sorties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The control tower rose from the tarmac like a lighthouse from concrete seas, its windows glowing amber in the darkness. Inside, banks of monitors cast blue-white pools of light across consoles lined with switches, dials, and readouts that tracked everything from wind speed to fuel temperatures. The air smelled of coffee that had been brewing too long, mixed with the metallic tang of electronic equipment, running at constant temperature, and the faint trace of jet fuel that seemed to permeate every surface on the base dot beyond the towers. Reinforced glass, the flight line stretched in both directions, a precise grid of concrete and steel where millions of dollars worth of military aircraft sat in various stages of preparation. F-16 Fighting Falcons dominated the scene, their sleek forms hunched like predators waiting to spring. Ground crews moved between them with practiced efficiency, their flashlights creating moving constellations of white light as they performed pre-flight inspections. The sound of their work carried on the still air, the metallic clang of access panels being opened and closed, the hydraulic whine of systems being tested, the sharp crack of canopy sealing shut. Each aircraft represented years of engineering, excellence, and millions of taxpayer dollars. But more than that, each one was a cocoon that would soon carry a pilot into three-dimensional space, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. The jets bore tail numbers painted in regulation white numerals, but to the crews who worked on them, each had its own personality, its own quirks and preferences that could only be learned through countless hours of intimate familiarity. The hangar adjacent to the tower hummed with different energy. Inside its cavernous space, maintenance teams worked under harsh fluorescent lights that made everything appear stark and colorless. Pneumatic tools hissed and chattered as technicians replaced components, their voices echoing off the corrugated metal walls. Tool carts rolled across polished concrete floors, their wheels creating a steady rhythm that counterpointed the sharper sounds of metal on metal. The smell here was stronger, hydraulic fluid, lubricants, and the ozone scent of electrical work being performed under pressure. A fuel truck rumbled past the tower's base, its driver navigating by memory and the faint illumination of ground lights that marked safe passage through the maze of aircraft and equipment. The truck's engine had the deep, labored sound of something carrying substantial weight, and its passage stirred up dust that caught briefly in the tower's exterior lights before dispersing into the darkness. Behind it, a tow tractor hauled a maintenance platform toward one of the waiting fighters, its warning beeper cutting through the ambient noise with metronomic persistence. The eastern horizon showed the first hint of color change, a barely perceptible lightning that spoke of dawn still an hour away. Above, stars held their positions in crystal clarity, the desert air providing the kind of visibility that made navigation by celestial reference not just possible but instinctive. The moon, 3/4 full, cast enough light to reveal the stark beauty of the surrounding landscape, rolling hills covered in sagebrush, punctuated by the occasional Joshua tree standing in solitary defiance of the harsh environment. Weather conditions were optimal. Winds were light and variable, visibility unlimited, cloud ceiling well above operational minimums. It was the kind of morning that made flying not just possible but pleasurable, the kind of conditions that allowed pilots to focus on their missions rather than fighting the elements. The base meteorology station had confirmed what anyone stepping outside could feel: A perfect day for aviation was about to begin. Inside the tower, RADIO equipment lined every available surface. Multiple transceivers sat in neat rows, their LED displays showing various frequencies, signal strengths, and operational status. Emergency backup systems hummed quietly in the background, ready to take over instantly if primary systems failed. Digital clocks displayed times for multiple zones, local, Zulu, and various operational theaters around the globe where American forces maintained presence. The electromagnetic spectrum was alive with traffic, military frequencies carrying routine check-ins, civilian aviation reporting positions, and the steady pulse of navigation beacons, broadcasting their electronic signatures across hundreds of miles. Ground vehicles moved with purpose across the tarmac. A fire truck from the crash rescue station completed its routine patrol, its crew checking hydrant locations and access routes that they hoped never to need, but trained constantly to use. An ambulance followed a parallel route, its own crew running through mental checklists of trauma procedures and evacuation protocols. Both vehicles represented the unglamorous but essential support structure that made high-performance aviation possible. The base itself sprawled across thousands of acres of federal land, its boundaries marked by security fencing that disappeared into the darkness in both directions. Within those boundaries lay not just aircraft and runways, but a complete ecosystem designed to support aerial operations, fuel storage, facilities with their maze of pipes and safety systems, munitions bunkers built to withstand direct hits, maintenance shops equipped with tools that could rebuild an engine from component parts, and living quarters that housed the hundreds of personnel required to keep even a modest airbase operational around the clock. Communications antennae sprouted from various points across the facility, their red warning lights blinking in synchronized patterns that created a visual rhythm against the starfield above. These towers carried voice, data, and navigation signals that connected Blackwater to bases across the continent and beyond. Through them flowed the constant stream of information that modern military aviation demanded: weather updates, mission parameters, intelligence briefings, and the thousands of small administrative details that kept the complex machinery of air power functioning smoothly. The surrounding desert held its own secrets. Test ranges stretched for miles beyond the base perimeter, marked by beacons whose positions were known to electronic precision but whose purposes remained classified. Environmental sensors monitored everything from seismic activity to radiation levels, their data streaming continuously to monitoring stations both on and off the base. Wild horses occasionally wandered near the outer fences, their presence triggering motion sensors that required human verification to distinguish between animal activity and potential security threats. As the first hint of true dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the tempo of activity on the flight line increased. Pilots would soon emerge from their briefing rooms, helmets under their arms, flight plans committed to memory, ready to strap themselves into machines capable of speeds that would have been unimaginable just decades earlier. But first, the ground crews had to complete their meticulous preparations. The air traffic controllers had to verify their equipment status, and the radio operators had to ensure that every frequency was clear and every backup system was ready. Desert morning air carried the promise of heat to come, but for now it remained crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of a military installation preparing for another day of operations. Somewhere in the distance, a jet engine began its startup sequence, the whine of the turbine climbing steadily in pitch until it reached operational speed. Soon, that sound would multiply as aircraft after aircraft came to life, transforming the quiet pride-on scene into the controlled chaos of a fully operational airbase. Above it all, the control tower stood as the nerve center of the entire operation, its radio frequencies serving as the electronic highways that would guide aircraft safely through increasingly crowded skies. Within its walls, Equipment worth millions of dollars sat ready to perform functions that seemed almost magical to those who didn't understand their operation. The ability to track objects moving at hundreds of miles per hour, to communicate across distances that spanned continents, and to coordinate the movements of multiple aircraft, operating in three-dimensional space with precision measured in feet and seconds. The night shift was ending. But the morning shift was just beginning, and with it would come challenges that no one in the tower could yet anticipate. Sarah Chun moved to the control tower with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate spaces designed by and for people who rarely noticed her presence. Her footsteps on the polished linoleum floor were barely audible beneath the constant electronic hum that filled the air, a symphony of cooling fans, power supplies, and data processing equipment that formed the technological heartbeat of modern aviation control. She carried herself with the careful posture of someone accustomed to working in cramped spaces around expensive, sensitive equipment where a careless elbow could cause thousands of dollars in damage or, worse, compromise the safety of aircraft. And pilots. At 28, Sarah had already accumulated more flight hours than many pilots, though she had never left the ground in anything faster than a commercial airliner. Her expertise lay not in the physics of flight, but in the invisible electromagnetic spectrum that made modern aviation possible. While pilots focused on stick and rudder skills, navigation, and tactical systems, Sarah lived in the world of frequency modulation, signal propagation, and the subtle art of voice procedure that could mean the difference between clear communication and dangerous misunderstanding. Her workstation occupied a corner of the tower's main floor, positioned strategically to provide sightlines to both the primary runway and the approach corridors, while remaining close enough to the master communications panel to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously. The desk itself was a study in organized efficiency. 3 large monitors arranged in a gentle arc, their screens divided into frequency waterfalls, signal strength meters, and communication logs that scrolled past in real time. A professional-grade headset hung from a custom bracket, its ear cups worn smooth from thousands of hours of use. The microphone positioned with the precision of someone who understood that voice clarity could be a matter of life and death, unlike the air traffic controllers who occupied the tower's elevated positions. Sarah's role existed in the shadows of aviation operations. Controllers guided aircraft through takeoffs, landings, and traffic patterns with the authority that came from Federal Aviation Administration, certification, and years of specialized training. Their voices carried the weight of legal responsibility, their decisions backed by established procedures and extensive oversight. Sarah's domain was different. She managed the complex web of auxiliary communications that supported flight operations, but rarely received recognition or understanding from those who depended on it most. Her uniform bore the insignia of a technical sergeant, 3 stripes that placed her in the middle ranks of the enlisted hierarchy. The fabric showed the slight fading that came from regular washing and the inevitable exposure to high-powered radio transmissions that created microscopic electromagnetic effects over time. Her name tape read simply Chun in regulation block letters, offering no hint of the specialized knowledge she carried or the years of training that had prepared her for responsibilities that most people couldn't begin to understand. The morning briefing had ended 20 minutes earlier, leaving Sarah to prepare for a training exercise that promised to test every system and procedure the base could deploy. Operation Desert Thunder was designed to simulate high-intensity combat operations, pushing both equipment and personnel to their operational limits. For the pilots and air traffic controllers, it represented an opportunity to practice skills they hoped never to need in actual combat. For Sarah, it meant managing communication loads that would challenge even the most sophisticated equipment while maintaining the quality, reliability that combat operations demanded. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her colleagues from the communications squadron had already dispersed to their various posts, some to the backup control facility buried deep beneath the base's administrative complex, others to mobile communication trucks positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. Sarah remained in the tower because her particular expertise in frequency, coordination, and emergency protocols made her the logical choice for monitoring the exercise's most critical phase. She would serve as the link between multiple agencies, different services, and communication systems that had been designed by different contractors, using different standards during different decades. The other occupants of the tower treated Sarah with the polite indifference typically reserved for essential but invisible personnel. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the tower's senior air traffic controller, acknowledged her presence with professional courtesy but rarely engaged in conversation beyond the minimum required for operational coordination. His attention remained focused on the approaching complexity of managing 8 high-performance aircraft operating in close proximity while maintaining safety margins that left no room for error or miscommunication. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base operations officer, had arrived early to observe the exercise from the tower's best vantage point. His presence added an additional layer of formality to the morning's procedures, though he seemed more interested in the tactical aspects of the training than the technical details that occupied Sarah's attention. When he spoke, it was to the controllers or directly to flight leaders via radio. His questions focused on timing, positioning, and mission objectives rather than the underlying communication infrastructure that made such coordination possible. Captain Stevens, the communications watch officer, understood Sarah's role better than most, but remained focused on broader network management responsibilities that extended far beyond the immediate exercise. His concerns centered on maintaining connectivity with higher headquarters, ensuring backup systems remained operational, and coordinating with civilian authorities who needed advance warning of increased military aircraft activity in their airspace. He valued Sarah's expertise, but viewed her primarily as a technical specialist rather than an integral part of the operational team. The pilots themselves existed in a different world entirely. Their pre-flight briefings had covered weather, tactics, fuel planning, and emergency procedures, but the communication systems they would depend on remained largely invisible to them. They knew which frequencies to use and how to operate their radios, but the complex infrastructure that made those radios work might as well have been magic. They trusted that when they pressed their transmit buttons, their voices would reach the intended recipients clearly and without delay. But few had any understanding of the technology and expertise required to make that trust justified. Sarah's training had begun years earlier at Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi, where she had learned the theoretical foundations of radio wave propagation, frequency management, and communication security. The coursework had been demanding, requiring mastery of concepts that combined physics, electronics, and information theory in ways that challenged even students with strong technical backgrounds. But the real education had come during subsequent assignments at bases around the world, where she had learned to troubleshoot equipment failures under pressure, coordinate communication needs between incompatible systems, and maintain operational capability in environments that ranged from Arctic cold to desert heat. Her current position represented the culmination of that experience, but it also highlighted the paradox of specialized expertise in large organizations. The more essential her skills became, the less visible they were to those who depended on them. Pilots flew their missions confident that their radios would work. Controllers managed traffic knowing that their coordination would reach its intended recipients. And commanders made decisions based on information that flowed through communication channels they rarely thought about. Sarah's competence made their confidence possible, but that same competence rendered her nearly invisible to the operational community she served. The morning's personnel assignments reflected this dynamic perfectly. The pilots had been assigned based on experience levels, aircraft qualifications, and mission requirements. Controllers had been positioned according to shift schedules and workload distribution. Sarah had been assigned to the tower because someone needed to be there, and she was qualified to fill the role. Her specific expertise, her track record of solving complex communication problems, and her ability to maintain operational capability under stress had factored into the decision, but only as background considerations that never made it into official documentation. She adjusted the frequency settings on her primary radio, fine-tuning the receiver to account for atmospheric conditions that would change as the sun climbed higher and began affecting radio wave propagation. The morning's temperature inversion would gradually dissipate, altering the electromagnetic environment in subtle but measurable ways. Most communication equipment was designed to operate effectively across a wide range of conditions, but Sarah understood that effectively and optimally were different standards, and today's exercise would demand optimal performance from every system involved. Her secondary monitor displayed real-time atmospheric data, temperature gradients, humidity levels, solar activity indices, and geomagnetic field measurements that influenced radio communication in ways that most operators never considered. Sarah tracked these variables automatically, adjusting her equipment configuration to maintain peak performance as conditions changed. It was a skill set that had taken years to develop and required constant practice to maintain, but it was also a capability that remained largely unrecognized by those who benefited from it most. The irony was not lost on her. In an age of satellite communication, GPS navigation, and digital data links, voice radio remained the backbone of aviation safety. When sophisticated systems failed, when satellite signals were jammed or blocked, when digital networks became overloaded or compromised, pilots and controllers fell back on the basic radio communication that Sarah had mastered. Her expertise represented the foundation upon which all other aviation technology was built, but it was also the most taken-for-granted aspect of the entire system. As the scheduled start time for Operation Desert Thunder approached, Sarah completed her final equipment checks, verified her backup systems, and settled into the focused mindset that complex operations required. Around her, the tower buzzed with increasing activity as controllers prepared for the controlled chaos that 8 high-performance aircraft would bring to their normally orderly airspace. Sarah remained at her station, ready to provide the invisible support that would make their success possible, knowing that if she performed her job perfectly, no one would notice her contribution at all. The first anomaly appeared at 0847 hours as a subtle distortion in the background static that most operators would have dismissed as atmospheric interference. Sarah's trained ear caught it immediately, a barely perceptible shift in the electromagnetic signature that suggested something was interfering with normal radio wave propagation. She frowned, adjusting her headset and fine-tuning the receiver to isolate the anomaly. The distortion lasted only 3 seconds before fading back into normal background noise, but those 3 seconds were enough to trigger her professional instincts. She pulled up the frequency analysis software on her secondary monitor, scrolling through spectral displays that showed radio energy distribution across the communication bands. The visualization looked normal at first glance, but Sarah had learned to read these displays the way a musician reads sheet music, recognizing patterns and variations that spoke to underlying conditions. There, buried in the lower frequencies, was evidence of the distortion she had heard. A brief spike of energy that shouldn't have been there, at a frequency that wasn't assigned to any known transmitter in the area. 8 F-16 Fighting Falcons were beginning their taxi sequence, their pilots running through final checklist items while ground crews completed last-minute inspections. The aircraft represented over $200 million in military hardware, but more importantly, they carried 8 of the squadron's most experienced pilots into an exercise designed to push both man and machine to operational limits. Each jet-burned fuel at rates measured in gallons per minute, carried weapons worth more than most people's homes, and operated systems so complex that their full capabilities remained classified even from the pilots who flew them. Sarah reached for her logbook and made a careful notation: time, frequency, duration, and observed characteristics of the anomaly. Standard procedure required reporting any unusual electromagnetic activity to the watch supervisor, but she hesitated. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was already dealing with increased radio traffic as the exercise began, and Captain Stevens was coordinating with multiple agencies to ensure airspace deconfliction. A 3-second distortion that might have been caused by anything from solar activity to a malfunctioning piece of equipment hardly seemed worth interrupting their focus. The squadron commander's voice crackled over the primary frequency as he requested taxi clearance for his flight of 4 aircraft. Colonel Marcus Wright had over 3,000 flight hours in F-16s and a reputation for precision that made him the natural choice to lead the exercise's most challenging phase. His call sign, Viper 1, carried the authority of someone who had flown combat missions over 3 different continents and survived situations that had claimed less experienced pilots. Behind him, Viper 2 through 4 formed a precisely spaced line, their engines producing a harmonic thunder that vibrated through the tower's reinforced structure. The second flight, led by Major Jennifer Adams with call sign Thunder Lead, was completing pre-flight checks at the far end of the Fambu flight line. Adams had earned her position through a combination of exceptional flying skills and an analytical mind that made her particularly effective in complex training scenarios. Her flight would simulate opposing forces using tactics and electronic warfare techniques designed to challenge Viper Flight's ability to maintain communication and coordination under stress. The exercise planners had deliberately created scenarios that would test not just flying skills but the entire support infrastructure that made modern air combat possible. Sarah monitored multiple frequencies simultaneously, her attention divided between the normal progression of taxi and takeoff communications and her search for additional signs of the anomaly she had detected earlier. The frequency coordination plan for Operation Desert Thunder was complex, involving primary and backup channels for different phases of the exercise, emergency frequencies that remained constantly monitored, and specialized links for data transmission between aircraft and ground stations. Any disruption to this carefully orchestrated communication plan could cascade into confusion or, worse, safety hazards that might compromise the entire exercise. At 0851, the anomaly returned, this time lasting nearly 5 seconds and affecting multiple frequencies simultaneously. Sarah's equipment registered the distortion across a much wider spectrum than before, suggesting that whatever was causing the interference was either moving closer or increasing in power. She immediately began recording the signal characteristics, using specialized software that could analyze electromagnetic signatures and attempt to identify their sources. The results were troubling. The interference pattern didn't match any known natural phenomenon or authorized transmitter. She turned to Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who was coordinating takeoff clearances with the precision of someone who had managed similar operations hundreds of times before. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she called, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the radio chatter. "I'm detecting electromagnetic interference that could affect communications during the exercise. It's intermittent but increasing in duration and intensity." Rodriguez glanced in her direction without fully turning away from his primary displays. "Solar activity?" he asked, his attention already shifting back to an F-16, requesting permission to enter the active runway. The question was reasonable. Solar flares and geomagnetic storms could indeed cause communication disruptions, and the morning's space weather forecast had mentioned elevated solar activity levels. "Negative," Sarah replied, consulting her atmospheric monitoring display. Solar indices are within normal ranges, and the interference pattern doesn't match natural phenomena. This appears to be artificial in origin, possibly from an unauthorized transmitter or malfunctioning equipment. Rodriguez completed his current radio exchange before responding, his tone patient but clearly focused on more immediate concerns. "Can you localize the source?" he asked. "If its equipment malfunctions, we need to identify and isolate it before it affects flight operations." Sarah was already working on that problem, using direction-finding equipment that could triangulate radio sources by comparing signal strength and arrival times across multiple antennas. The process required several samples of the interfering signal, and since the anomaly appeared only intermittently, she would need to wait for additional occurrences before generating useful location data. "Working on it," she replied. "I'll need a few more samples to get an accurate bearing." The first 4 F-16s were now airborne, their afterburners painting brief orange flames against the morning sky as they climbed toward their initial altitudes. Colonel Wright's voice came through clearly as he checked in with departure control, his communications crisp and professional. But Sarah noticed something others missed: a slight degradation in signal quality during his transmission, subtle enough that most operators would attribute it to normal variations in radio propagation, but distinct enough to suggest that the interference was beginning to affect operational frequencies. At 0854, as Thunder Flight began its taxi sequence, the interference returned with unprecedented strength and duration. This time it lasted nearly 10 seconds and completely blocked communications on 2 separate frequencies. Sarah watched in growing alarm as her signal strength meters fluctuated wildly, and her frequency displays showed energy spikes across multiple bands. Whatever was causing the interference was not only getting stronger, but was also beginning to affect the primary communication channels that the exercise depended on. "Rodriguez," she called urgently, her professional composure beginning to crack. "We have a major problem. The interference just blocked Thunder Lead's frequency completely. If this continues, we could lose communication with aircraft during critical phases of the exercise." This time Rodriguez turned to face her fully, his expression shifting from patient tolerance to focused concern. "How bad?" he asked, his experience telling him that Sarah's alarm was not misplaced. He had worked with enough communication specialists to recognize when technical concerns crossed the line from routine to serious. "Bad enough that we should consider aborting the exercise until we identify and eliminate the source," Sarah replied. "The interference is increasing in both strength and duration. If it affects communications during air-to-air combat maneuvering or weapon employment phases, we could have aircraft operating without the situational awareness they need to maintain." Safety. Rodriguez hesitated, caught between his responsibility for communication safety and the knowledge that aborting a major training exercise was not a decision he could make unilaterally. Operation Desert Thunder had required weeks of planning, coordination with multiple agencies, and the allocation of resources that cost thousands of dollars per hour to operate. The squadron commander, base operations officer, and exercise planners all had significant investments in the mission's success. "Can you work around it?" he asked, seeking a solution that would allow the exercise to continue while addressing Sarah's concerns. Frequency changes, power adjustments, alternative communication methods. Sarah was already considering those options, but her analysis was not encouraging. "Limited options," she replied. "The interference appears to be broadband, affecting multiple frequencies simultaneously. We could try switching to backup frequencies, but if the source is mobile or increasing in power, it might follow us there too. And some of the exercise scenarios specifically require the primary frequencies for realism." Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been monitoring the exchange from his position near the observation windows, approached Sarah's workstation. His expression was serious but controlled. reflecting the demeanor of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Sergeant Chun," he said formally, "what's your assessment of the risk to flight safety?" Sarah appreciated being asked directly for her professional opinion, but she also understood the weight of her answer. If she recommended aborting the exercise based on communication concerns, she would effectively be overruling weeks of planning and preparation based on her technical judgment alone. If she minimized the risk and something went wrong, the consequences could be far more serious than a canceled training mission. "Sir," she began carefully, "the interference is unprecedented in my experience. It's artificial, it's increasing in strength, and it's affecting multiple frequencies simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, I would recommend postponing operations until we identify and eliminate the source. However, if the exercise continues, I strongly recommend implementing enhanced communication procedures, establishing backup frequencies for all phases, and maintaining constant monitoring for further degradation." Harrison nodded thoughtfully, weighing her technical assessment against operational requirements. "How confident are you in your assessment?" he asked. "Very confident in the technical analysis," Sarah replied. "Less confident in predicting how the interference will evolve. If it continues to increase at the current rate, we could face complete communication blackouts during critical phases of the exercise." The conversation was interrupted by another burst of interference, this one lasting 12 seconds and completely blocking communications on the primary exercise frequency. In the resulting silence, everyone in the tower could hear only the steady hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of jet engines as Thunder Flight continued its taxi toward the active runway. "That settles it," Harrison declared. But before he could issue orders to abort the exercise, Captain Stevens interrupted from his position at the communication coordination console. "Sir," Stevens called out, "I'm receiving reports of similar interference from other bases in the region. This isn't localized to our equipment. It appears to be affecting a much wider area." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. If the interference was affecting multiple military installations across a broad geographic area, it wasn't a simple equipment malfunction or unauthorized transmitter. It was something much larger, much more serious, and potentially much more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. At 09:03 hours, the decision was made to continue Operation Desert Thunder despite Sarah's warnings. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison weighed the technical concerns against operational imperatives and concluded that the exercise represented too significant an investment in training value, fuel costs, and coordinated personnel to abort based on intermittent communication anomalies. His reasoning was sound from a command perspective. Military operations routinely proceeded under less than ideal conditions, and pilots needed experience operating with degraded communications as much as they needed practice with perfect systems. "We continue as planned," Harrison announced to the tower personnel. "Implement backup communication protocols, monitor the situation closely, and be prepared to abort individual phases if conditions deteriorate further." The decision carried the weight of command authority, but Sarah could see the underlying calculation in his expression. Canceling the exercise would require explanations to higher headquarters, justifications for wasted resources, and potentially damage to his own career progression in an environment where operational success was measured by mission completion rates. Master Sergeant Rodriguez nodded his acknowledgement and immediately began coordinating with the pilots to establish alternate frequencies for different phases of the exercise. The process was more complex than simply changing radio channels. Each frequency change required updating navigation aids, data links, and emergency procedures that had been carefully planned to work in concert. What should have been a seamless training evolution began to fragment into separate coordination challenges that divided attention and increased workload for everyone involved. Sarah returned to her monitoring equipment with growing unease. Electromagnetic interference continued to evolve in ways that defied her initial analysis. Rather than remaining constant or increasing linearly, the anomalies now appeared in complex patterns that suggested multiple sources operating in coordination. Her direction-finding equipment was providing contradictory readings, indicating that the interference was either coming from multiple locations simultaneously or from sources that were deliberately masking their positions through technical means she had never encountered before. Thunderflight completed its takeoff sequence and climbed toward the designated training area, a block of restricted airspace that extended from 15,000 feet to the flight ceiling where civilian aircraft were prohibited during military exercises. Major Adams' voice came through clearly as she checked in with departure control, but Sarah noticed that her transmission was accompanied by the same subtle degradation that had affected earlier communications. The interference was not only continuing, but was beginning to follow the aircraft as they moved away from the base. Viper flight had already reached the initial point for the exercise's first phase, a complex air-to-air engagement scenario that would test both flight's ability to locate, identify, and engage simulated enemy aircraft while maintaining formation integrity and communication discipline. Colonel Wright's tactical experience was evident in his radio procedures using brevity, codes, and standardized phraseology that maximized information transfer while minimizing transmission time. But even his efficient communication style couldn't compensate for the increasing signal degradation that made every exchange more difficult to understand. At 0908, the interference reached a new level of intensity that caused Sarah's equipment to register overload conditions on multiple frequency bands simultaneously. The electromagnetic storm that had been building for the past 20 minutes finally reached sufficient strength to completely block communications on the primary exercise frequency for 37 consecutive seconds. During that time, 8 F-16 Fighting Falcons operated in contested airspace without the ability to coordinate their movements, share tactical information, or receive guidance from ground controllers who were responsible for their safety. The silence was deafening. Sarah watched her signal strength meters flatline while her frequency displays showed nothing but electromagnetic chaos across the communication spectrum. She could see aircraft position indicators on the radar displays, but without voice communication. The controllers had no way to provide guidance, issue warnings, or coordinate the complex three-dimensional ballet that air combat maneuvering required. For 37 seconds, millions of dollars worth of military aircraft operated blind and deaf in an environment where split-second timing could mean the difference between mission success and mid-air collision. When communications returned, the pilots' voices carried tension that hadn't been present before. Colonel Wright's first transmission was clipped and urgent. Blackwater Control, Viper 1, radio check. The request for communication verification was standard procedure after a communication failure, but his tone suggested that the loss of contact had occurred during a critical phase of the engagement that required immediate coordination. Viper 1, Blackwater Control, you're 5x5, Rodriguez responded, using the standard phrase that indicated perfect signal strength and clarity. But Sarah could hear the strain in his voice as he tried to re-establish positive control over aircraft that had been operating independently during the communication blackout. The careful choreography of the exercise had been disrupted, and everyone involved was working to prevent the disruption from cascading into something more dangerous. Major Adams' voice followed immediately. Blackwater Control, Thunder Lead. We've lost visual contact with Viper flight during the communication failure. Request immediate position updates and guidance for reestablishment. Her transmission revealed the exercise's first serious safety concern. 2 flights of high performance aircraft operating in the same airspace had lost sight of each other during a period when they couldn't communicate their positions or intentions. Sarah's analysis of the interference pattern was becoming increasingly alarming. The electromagnetic signatures she was recording didn't match any known natural phenomena, authorized military transmitters, or commercial communication systems. The frequency bands being affected were specifically those allocated for military aviation, suggesting that whatever was causing the interference was either targeting those frequencies deliberately or was sophisticated enough to focus its effects on the most critical communication channels. She attempted to contact Captain Stevens at the Communication Coordination Console, but found that the interference was now affecting internal base communications as well. The landline phones carried static that made conversation difficult, and the computer networks that linked different sections of the base were experiencing intermittent data loss that corrupted message traffic and file transfers. What had begun as a radio frequency problem was expanding into a comprehensive communication breakdown that threatened all forms of electronic coordination. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was becoming increasingly agitated as reports filtered in from other military installations across the region. Nellis Air Force Base reported similar interference affecting their training operations. Edwards Air Force Base had been forced to ground test flights due to communication failures. Even civilian air traffic control centers were reporting degraded radar performance and radio communication problems that were forcing them to implement emergency procedures designed for equipment failures. "Sergeant Chen," Harrison called out, his voice cutting through the increased chatter in the tower. "I need your best assessment of what we're dealing with. Is this equipment failure, atmospheric disturbance, or something else?" Sarah took a deep breath before responding, knowing that her answer would influence decisions that affected not just the current exercise but potentially the safety of aircraft operations across multiple states. "Sir, based on the technical characteristics I'm observing, this is neither equipment failure nor natural atmospheric disturbance. The interference is artificial, coordinated, and specifically targeting military communication frequencies. The pattern suggests either a sophisticated electronic warfare exercise that we weren't briefed on, or—" She hesitated before voicing the conclusion her technical analysis was pointing toward. "Or what, Sergeant?" Harrison demanded, his patience clearly strained by the developing crisis. "Or we're experiencing a deliberate electronic attack designed to disrupt military aviation operations," Sarah finished. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming the situation from a training problem into a potential national security incident. If her assessment was correct, Operation Desert Thunder was no longer an exercise but had become the target of hostile action by an unknown adversary with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities. The implications cascaded through everyone's thinking simultaneously. If the interference was indeed an attack, then continuing flight operations might be playing directly into the adversary's hands. But if they grounded all aircraft based on Sarah's technical analysis alone, they would be allowing an unknown threat to dictate American military operations without firing a shot or crossing a border. The decision tree had suddenly become much more complex, with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate training exercise. In 0912, the interference reached its most intense level yet, completely blocking all radio communications for nearly 2 minutes while simultaneously jamming GPS signals that the aircraft depended on for navigation. In the tower, Sarah watched her equipment register electromagnetic energy levels that exceeded the design specifications of most military communication systems. The attack, if that's what it was, had evolved from a nuisance to a genuine threat to flight safety that could no longer be ignored or minimized. During those 2 minutes of communication blackout, 8 F-16 Fighting Falcons flew through contested airspace without the ability to coordinate with each other or with ground controllers, navigate using their primary systems, or call for assistance if mechanical emergencies developed. They were alone in 3-dimensional space, Flying aircraft worth $30 million each, carrying weapons and fuel loads that made them as dangerous to themselves as to any potential enemy. When communication returned this time, the pilots' voices carried a new edge of concern that reflected their growing awareness that something beyond normal training difficulties was affecting their mission. Colonel Wright's transmission was immediate and direct. Blackwater Control, Viper 1 declaring emergency communication failure. Request immediate guidance for recovery to base. The phrase declaring emergency changed everything. What had been a training exercise with communication difficulties had officially become an emergency situation requiring immediate response from rescue and firefighting teams, medical personnel, and senior commanders who needed to be notified whenever military aircraft declared emergencies. The cascade of required notifications and responses would soon involve personnel far beyond the immediate. Participants in Operation Desert Thunder. Sarah realized that her warnings about the communication anomalies had been prescient, but she also understood that being right about a developing crisis was small consolation when that crisis was now threatening the safety of 8 pilots and aircraft worth $250 million. The time for technical analysis and measured recommendations had passed. The situation now required immediate action to bring the aircraft safely back to Earth before the interference claimed its first victims. At 0916 hours, Sarah Chun made a FIDE decision that would define her career and potentially save 8 lives. As the electromagnetic storm reached catastrophic intensity and communication systems across the region collapsed into chaos, she abandoned her assigned monitoring role and moved directly to the master communication console. The action violated protocols that required permission from the watch supervisor before touching primary control equipment, but Sarah's technical analysis had convinced her that conventional procedures were inadequate for the crisis they faced. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was simultaneously coordinating with multiple agencies while trying to re-establish contact with aircraft that had been silent for over 3 minutes. His face showed the strain of someone wrestling with responsibilities that exceeded available resources, managing a crisis that had evolved beyond standard emergency procedures. When he saw Sarah approaching the primary console, his initial reaction was to wave her away, but something in her expression stopped him mid-gesture. "I need access to the emergency frequency network," Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that her rank didn't technically support, but her expertise absolutely justified. "The primary communication systems are compromised, but there's a backup network that operates on different frequencies and uses older technology that might be resistant to the electronic attack." Rodriguez hesitated for a crucial second, caught between protecting expensive equipment from unauthorized operation and recognizing that Sarah might possess knowledge that could resolve the crisis. His decision was simplified by another burst of interference that completely blanked every frequency monitor in the tower simultaneously. Whatever Sarah wanted to try couldn't make the situation worse than it already was. "Do it," he said, stepping aside to give her access to controls that few people on the base were qualified to operate. The Master Communication Console represented decades of technological evolution, with newer digital systems layered over older analog equipment that had been retained for exactly this type of emergency. Sarah's fingers moved across switches and dials with the confidence of someone who understood not just how to operate the equipment, but why it had been designed the way it was. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison appeared at her shoulder as she worked, his face tense with the realization that a technical sergeant was now their best hope for re-establishing contact with 8 missing aircraft. "What's your plan, Sergeant?" he asked, his tone reflecting the commander's need to understand what was happening while acknowledging that he was now dependent on expertise he didn't possess. "The electronic attack is targeting modern digital communication systems," Sarah explained as her hands continued working. "But we have legacy analog equipment that operates on different principles and frequencies. It's lower quality, more susceptible to interference, and requires manual operation. But it might be able to punch through the jamming because it doesn't rely on the digital protocols that are being targeted. Her explanation was necessarily simplified. The technical reality was more complex. Modern military radios used frequency hopping spread spectrum technology that constantly changed frequencies according to predetermined patterns, making them extremely difficult to jam effectively. But that same sophistication made them vulnerable to attacks that could predict or disrupt the frequency hopping algorithms. The older analog systems used fixed frequencies and continuous transmission that could be jammed by brute force, but they could also potentially overpower jamming signals through raw transmission power. Sarah activated the emergency high-frequency transmitter, a piece of equipment that predated digital communication by decades, but remained in the tower specifically for situations where modern systems failed. The transmitter was powerful enough to reach aircraft hundreds of miles away, but it required manual tuning and careful operation to avoid interfering with other users of the electromagnetic spectrum. Under normal circumstances, its use required coordination with multiple agencies and advanced planning to prevent conflicts with commercial and civilian communication systems. These were not normal circumstances. As Sarah adjusted the transmitter's frequency and power settings, she was violating numerous regulations about unauthorized high-power transmissions, but she was also potentially saving the lives of 8 pilots who had been flying without communication or navigation aids for nearly 4 minutes. The aircraft carried enough fuel for approximately 2 hours of flight, but without GPS guidance or radio contact with ground controllers, the pilots had no way to navigate back to their home base or locate alternate landing sites. The first transmission attempt produced only static mixed with the electronic warfare signals that were saturating the communication spectrum. Sarah adjusted the frequency slightly and increased the power output, pushing the transmitter beyond its normal operating parameters in an attempt to overpower the jamming. The equipment began generating heat that she could feel through the control panel, and warning lights indicated that various safety systems were being stressed beyond their design limits. Viper flight, this is Blackwater emergency control on emergency frequency. How do you read? Sarah's voice carried across hundreds of miles of electromagnetic chaos, powered by equipment that was converting enough electrical energy to supply a small town. The transmission was so powerful that it briefly interfered with communication systems on the base itself, causing radio speakers throughout the facility to crackle with feedback. For 15 seconds, there was no response except the electronic cacophony of the ongoing attack. Sarah adjusted the frequency again, fine-tuning the transmitter based on atmospheric conditions and propagation models that she calculated in her head using knowledge accumulated over years of studying radio wave behavior. Her second transmission was even more powerful, pushing the equipment to its absolute limits. Blackwater emergency control, this is Viper 1. Colonel Wright's voice burst through the static with startling clarity, the relief in his transmission evident even through the electromagnetic interference. We've been flying blind for 5 minutes. GPS is down. All navigation aids are compromised, and we're operating on dead reckoning with fuel becoming a factor. Sarah's heart rate spiked as she realized the full scope of what the pilots were facing. Dead reckoning navigation required constant calculation of position based on speed, heading, and elapsed time, but even small errors could accumulate quickly into significant positional uncertainty. Without GPS confirmation, the pilots could be anywhere within a circle dozens of miles in diameter, making it impossible to provide accurate guidance back to the base. Viper 1, Blackwater emergency control copies, Sarah responded, her training taking over as she shifted into the precise communication protocols that emergency situations demanded. We show you bearing 090 degrees from base, approximately 40 nautical miles. Steer heading 270 for recovery. Be advised, we are experiencing coordinated electronic warfare attack affecting all navigation and communication systems. But even as she provided the guidance, Sarah realized that the information might be useless. The radar systems that normally track aircraft positions were also being affected by the electronic attack, providing position data that was increasingly unreliable. Without accurate position information for either the aircraft or the base itself, any navigation guidance she provided could lead the pilots further from safety rather than toward it. Thunder lead, this is Blackwater Emergency Control, Sarah continued, attempting to contact the second flight of 4 aircraft that had been equally affected by the communication blackout. Major Adams' response came through even more faintly than Colonel Wright's, indicating that her flight was either further away or experiencing more severe jamming. Blackwater Emergency Control, Thunder Lead. We've lost contact with Viper Flight and are operating independently. Navigation systems are unreliable, and we're estimating position based on landmarks, but visibility is degrading due to atmospheric conditions. Adams' transmission revealed another complication. The clear weather that had made the morning perfect for flying was giving way to haze and scattered clouds. That made visual navigation increasingly difficult. Sarah's mind raced through the technical and tactical challenges facing the 8 pilots. They were flying high-performance aircraft with limited fuel reserves, no reliable navigation systems, and no ability to communicate with each other or coordinate their movements. The electronic attack had effectively isolated each aircraft, forcing experienced pilots to operate as if they were flying in the early days of aviation, when navigation was purely visual and communication between aircraft was impossible. The electromagnetic interference suddenly intensified again, reaching levels that caused Sarah's emergency transmitter to overload and automatically shut down to prevent damage. In the resulting silence, she realized that whoever was conducting the electronic attack had detected her emergency transmissions and was now specifically targeting the frequencies she was using. The attack was not only sophisticated, but was actively adapting to countermeasures in real time. "They're jamming the emergency frequencies now," she announced to Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been monitoring her exchanges with the aircraft. "Whoever is doing this knows exactly what they're targeting and is adapting their tactics as we respond. This isn't a random attack or equipment malfunction. It's a coordinated assault by someone with detailed knowledge of our communication systems." Harrison's expression darkened as the implications became clear. If the electronic attack was being conducted by a foreign adversary with intimate knowledge of American military communication systems, then the 8 missing F-16s were not just experiencing a training emergency, but were potentially under attack by hostile forces. The rules of engagement for such a situation were complex and required notifications that extended all the way to the Pentagon and possibly the White House. Sarah was already working to restart the emergency transmitter, bypassing safety systems that had shut it down and manually resetting circuit breakers that had tripped under the overload conditions. The equipment was not designed for the type of operation she was demanding from it, but conventional procedures had already proven inadequate for the crisis they faced. She would either find a way to re-establish communication with the missing aircraft, or 8 of America's most experienced fighter pilots would be forced to attempt emergency landings at unknown locations with unreliable navigation systems and diminishing fuel supplies. As she worked, Sarah could feel the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical presence. The technical knowledge that had made her nearly invisible during routine operations was now the only thing standing between 8 pilots and potential disaster. Her expertise in electromagnetic systems, frequency management, and emergency communication procedures had suddenly become the most valuable capabilities in a control tower full of people with higher ranks and greater authority. The restart sequence for the emergency transmitter required nearly 2 minutes to complete. during which time the 8 F-16s continued flying through hostile, electromagnetic environments without guidance or coordination. When the equipment finally came back online, Sarah immediately began transmitting on frequencies that the electronic attack had not yet targeted, hoping to re-establish contact before the jamming adapted to her new tactics. At 0923 hours, Sarah's modified emergency transmitter pierced through the electromagnetic chaos, with a signal so powerful it momentarily overwhelmed the jamming systems that had paralyzed military communications across 3 states. Her voice, amplified by equipment pushed far beyond its design specifications, reached 8 F-16 Fighting Falcons, scattered across hundreds of square miles of airspace with crystal clarity that cut through the electronic warfare like a lighthouse beam. Through fog. All Viper and Thunder aircraft, this is Blackwater Emergency Recovery Control. I have emergency navigation solutions for immediate implementation. Acknowledge by flight and prepare to copy heading and distance information. Sarah's transmission carried the authority of someone who had moved beyond following procedures to creating new ones in real time. The electromagnetic signature of her transmission was unlike anything the jamming systems had been programmed to counter, using frequency modulation techniques and power levels that predated modern electronic warfare doctrine. Colonel writes, response was immediate and precise. Blackwater Emergency Recovery, Viper 1 copies all. Flight 4, fuel state becoming critical, ready to copy navigation guidance. His voice carried the strain of a pilot who had been flying without instruments for nearly 10 minutes, navigating by dead reckoning while managing a formation of aircraft worth over $100 million. Behind his professional composure was the recognition that Sarah's transmission represented their first reliable contact with the outside world since the electronic attack had begun. Sarah's fingers moved across frequency analyzers and atmospheric monitoring equipment as she calculated propagation corrections for the navigation data she was about to transmit. The pilots needed more than just heading and distance information. They required precise guidance that accounted for wind drift, atmospheric refraction effects, and the cumulative errors that had built up during their period of instrument-free flight. Her calculations incorporated meteorological data that most navigators would consider secondary factors, but that could mean the difference between successful recovery and fuel exhaustion over hostile terrain. Viper 1, steer heading 265 degrees magnetic, distance to base 42 nautical miles. Winds aloft 090 degrees at 15 knots. Your current position estimate places you southeast of the planned recovery route. Begin descent to flight level 200 and maintain that altitude until further advised. Sarah's guidance was based on triangulation data from multiple sources, radar returns that she had filtered through algorithms designed to eliminate jamming-induced false targets, atmospheric backscatter analysis that revealed aircraft positions, through electromagnetic reflections, and dead reckoning calculations that worked backward from known departure times and headings. The technical complexity of what Sarah was accomplishing in real time would normally require teams of specialists, working with sophisticated computer systems over periods of hours or days. She was performing navigation calculations in her head while simultaneously operating emergency communication equipment, monitoring atmospheric conditions, and adapting to electronic countermeasures that evolved continuously. Her expertise had transformed from routine frequency management to becoming the primary navigation system for 8 aircraft, whose pilots depended entirely on her accuracy for survival. Major Adams' transmission from Thunder flight revealed additional complications. Blackwater Emergency Recovery, Thunder lead. We've been flying independent navigation for 12 minutes. The fuel state is amber, and we've encountered severe turbulence that may have affected our dead reckoning calculations. Request priority handling for immediate recovery. The phrase fuel state amber indicated that Thunder flight had consumed enough fuel to reach the point where landing options were becoming limited, while severe turbulence suggested that their estimated positions might be significantly different from their actual locations. Sarah's response required instantaneous analysis of multiple variables that would challenge experienced air traffic controllers under normal conditions. She had to coordinate the recovery of two separate flights approaching from different directions, account for fuel limitations that made extended navigation impossible, and provide guidance accurate enough to bring high-speed aircraft to a runway that they might not be able to see until the final moments of approach. All of this had to be accomplished while the electronic attack continued to degrade her own equipment and threatened to cut off communication at any moment. Thunder lead, Blackwater emergency recovery. Steer heading 300 degrees magnetic. Distance to base 38 nautical miles. You are priority for the straight-in approach to runway 09. Viper flight will hold at the initial approach fix until Thunder flight is on deck. Sarah's coordination was flawless, but it required her to make command decisions that exceeded her official authority. By designating approach priorities and issuing holding instructions, she was effectively functioning as the air traffic control supervisor for the most complex emergency recovery operation in the base's recent history. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had been monitoring Sarah's performance with growing amazement, stepped forward to provide official authorization for her actions. Sergeant Chun, you have full authority to coordinate this recovery operation. All base resources are at your disposal. His words carried weight that extended far beyond the immediate crisis, officially recognizing Sarah's expertise and giving her the command authority that her technical knowledge had already established and practiced. The electromagnetic interference suddenly shifted to new frequencies, indicating that whoever was conducting the attack had identified Sarah's emergency transmissions and was attempting to disrupt them. But her equipment modifications had created transmission characteristics that were difficult to jam effectively. The older analog systems used continuous wave modulation that could penetrate interference through raw power, while her frequency selection avoided the digital bands that the jamming was primarily targeting. Viper 1. Blackwater emergency recovery. Be advised, electronic attack is intensifying. Recommend you switch to backup navigation systems and prepare for possible communication loss during the final approach phase. Base recovery teams are standing by with visual signal capabilities if radio contact is lost. Sarah's warning reflected her understanding that the electronic warfare was becoming more sophisticated as it adapted to her countermeasures, but it also demonstrated her preparation for contingencies that extended beyond radio communication. The base emergency response had mobilized completely during the communication crisis. Crash rescue teams positioned their vehicles along the runway approach paths, ready to respond instantly if aircraft experienced mechanical failures during landing. Medical personnel stood by with ambulances and trauma equipment while firefighting. Teams prepared foam systems that could suppress fuel fires if any of the returning aircraft suffered landing gear failures or other emergencies. The entire installation had transformed from routine training operations to maximum emergency posture in response to Sarah's coordination. Colonel Wright's next transmission carried a new tone of confidence. Blackwater emergency recovery. Viper 1 has visual contact with the base. Navigation guidance was accurate within 1 nautical mile. Requesting approach clearance for Flight 4. His confirmation that Sarah's navigation calculations had been accurate was more than professional acknowledgement. It was validation of technical expertise that had guided 4 aircraft, carrying sophisticated weapons and million-dollar systems, safely through a hostile electromagnetic environment to visual contact with their home base. Sarah's response was immediate and precise. Viper 1 cleared for straight-in approach. Runway 09. Contact tower frequency 121.9. For landing clearance. Emergency equipment is standing by. but your approach looks normal." Her coordination seamlessly transitioned the aircraft from emergency navigation back to standard approach procedures. But her monitoring continued as she tracked their progress through equipment that was still being affected by ongoing electronic interference. Thunder Flight's recovery proved more challenging due to their fuel limitations and the atmospheric conditions that had complicated their dead reckoning navigation. Major Adams' voice carried increased urgency as she reported, "Blackwater emergency recovery. Thunder lead approaching minimum fuel state. We need immediate clearance for approach with no delays or holding patterns." The phrase "minimum fuel" state indicated that Thunder Flight had reached the point where any significant deviation from direct approach could result in fuel exhaustion before landing. Sarah's response required her to coordinate with multiple agencies simultaneously, while maintaining the split-second timing that fuel-critical aircraft demanded. "Thunder Lead, you are cleared for immediate straight-in approach runway 09. All other traffic is being held clear of your approach path. Crash rescue teams are positioned and ready. Your approach is priority 1 for the entire facility." Her coordination involved not just air traffic control but also coordination with civilian aviation authorities who needed to redirect commercial aircraft away from the military base's airspace during the emergency dot as both flights began their final approach phases. The electronic interference suddenly ceased completely. The abrupt termination of jamming that had paralyzed communications for over 15 minutes was as dramatic as its beginning, leaving behind clear frequencies and normal electromagnetic conditions that seemed almost unnaturally quiet after the chaos of the attack. Sarah's equipment registered the change immediately, but her focus remained on guiding the aircraft safely to the ground rather than analyzing the implications of the jamming's termination. "Viper 1, touchdown runway 09, Colonel Wright reported as his flight completed successful landings with spacing that demonstrated exceptional piloting skill under adverse conditions. All aircraft are Code 1. The phrase Code 1 indicated that all 4 F-16s had landed without mechanical problems or crew injuries, a remarkable achievement considering the navigation challenges they had overcome during their instrument-free flight. Thunder Flight's landing followed 3 minutes later, with Major Adams reporting similar success. Thunder Lead, flight of 4 on deck, all aircraft Code 1. Fuel remaining was less than 5 minutes flight time. Her report confirmed how close the situation had come to potential disaster, with fuel margins that left no room for navigation errors or approach complications. In the control tower, Sarah finally allowed herself to step back from the emergency communication console as normal radio frequencies came back online and standard air traffic control procedures resumed. Around her, the facility buzzed with activity as controllers, supervisors, and emergency personnel began the complex process of documenting the incident and analyzing what had occurred. But for the first time since the crisis began, Sarah could hear something that had been absent for nearly 20 minutes, the sound of normal radio traffic, clear and unimpeded by electronic interference. "Master," Sergeant Rodriguez approached her with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal amazement. "Sergeant Chun, that was the most impressive display of emergency communication and navigation I've witnessed in 20 years of air traffic control. You saved 8 aircraft and probably 8 lives with expertise that I didn't know existed on this base." His acknowledgement carried weight that extended beyond the immediate crisis, recognizing capabilities that had remained invisible until the moment they became essential for survival. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Blackwater Air Station as investigators from multiple agencies began arriving to examine the electromagnetic attack that had paralyzed military communications across the Southwest. Black SUVs with government plates lined the visitor parking area, their occupants carrying briefcases filled with classified analysis equipment and security clearances that granted access to information most base personnel would never see. The morning's crisis had attracted attention from the highest levels of military and civilian leadership, transforming a routine training exercise into a case study that would influence electronic warfare doctrine for years to come. Sarah Chun sat in the base commander's conference room, still wearing the same uniform she had put on before dawn, now wrinkled from hours of intense concentration and physical stress. Around the polished oak table sat men and women whose ranks and positions represented the upper echelons of military command structure, brigadier generals, full colonels, and civilian officials whose exact roles remained deliberately vague, but whose authority was unmistakable. For someone who had spent her career operating in the background of military operations, the attention was both overwhelming and surreal. Colonel Patricia Williams, the base commander, had personally conducted the initial debriefing session. Her questions focused not just on the technical aspects of Sarah's response, but on the decision-making process that had led her to take unauthorized control of critical communication systems. Williams was a pilot herself, with combat experience that gave her intimate understanding of what the 8 F-16 pilots had experienced during their electronic isolation. Her questioning was thorough but respectful, recognizing that Sarah's actions had prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of personnel and equipment. Sergeant Chun, Colonel Williams began, consulting notes that covered several pages of precise handwriting. Your technical analysis identified the electronic attack as artificial and coordinated, approximately 13 minutes before our standard threat assessment protocols reached the same conclusion. Can you explain how you were able to make that determination so quickly? Sarah's response reflected years of specialized training that most military personnel never received. Ma'am, the electromagnetic signatures I observed didn't match any known natural phenomena or authorized transmitters. The frequency bands being targeted were specifically those allocated for military aviation, and the interference pattern showed coordination between multiple sources operating in real-time synchronization. Natural atmospheric disturbances don't exhibit that level of precision or adaptability. The technical explanation was accurate but simplified for an audience that included non-specialists. The reality was more complex. Sarah's analysis had involved pattern recognition, skills developed through thousands of hours studying electromagnetic signatures, mathematical calculations performed instinctively after years of practice, and intuitive understanding of radio wave propagation that combined scientific knowledge with practical experience. Her conclusion that the interference was an attack had been based on subtle indicators that would have been invisible to most communication specialists. Major General Robert Chun, no relation, despite the shared surname, represented the Air Force's electronic warfare community at the highest levels. His presence at the debriefing indicated that Sarah's actions had implications extending far beyond the immediate crisis. Sergeant Chun, your decision to use legacy analog equipment to penetrate the jamming was unprecedented in our experience. The modification techniques you employed aren't covered in any standard technical manual. Where did you learn those procedures? Sarah's answer revealed the depth of knowledge that had made her response possible. Sir, the procedures were based on principles I learned during advanced electronics training, combined with modifications I developed during previous assignments where standard equipment proved inadequate for specific mission requirements. The analog systems we used were designed during an era when electronic warfare was less sophisticated, but that same simplicity made them resistant to modern jamming techniques that target digital protocols. What Sarah didn't mention was the countless hours she had spent studying obsolete technical manuals, experimenting with equipment that most operators considered outdated, and developing theoretical solutions to problems that had never actually occurred. Her expertise represented a combination of formal training, practical experience, and intellectual curiosity that had prepared her for situations that no one had anticipated. The electronic attack had been unprecedented, but her response had been possible because she had prepared for scenarios that others had dismissed as unlikely, the investigation team's preliminary findings were both alarming and illuminating. The electronic attack had originated from multiple sources operating in coordination across several states, using sophisticated equipment that demonstrated intimate knowledge of American military communication systems. The attack had specifically targeted frequencies and protocols used by military aviation, suggesting that it had been planned by adversaries with detailed intelligence about operational procedures. Most disturbing was the evidence that the attack had been a test rather than an attempt to cause immediate damage, implying that more serious threats might follow. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a civilian expert in electronic warfare from the Defense Intelligence Agency, had spent the afternoon analyzing recordings of the electromagnetic signatures that Sarah had captured during the attack. Her analysis confirmed what Sarah had concluded in real time. The jamming had been conducted by professional operators, using military-grade equipment that was not available to terrorist organizations or criminal groups. The implications pointed towards state-sponsored electronic warfare capabilities that represented a new category of threat to American military operations. Sergeant Chun's technical analysis was not only accurate, but was more sophisticated than our initial assessment. Using dedicated intelligence collection systems, Dr. Martinez reported to the assembled officials. Her real-time adaptation to changing jamming patterns and her successful penetration of coordinated electronic countermeasures represent problem-solving capabilities that exceed our established response protocols. We need to understand how her approach differed from standard procedures and determine whether her techniques can be incorporated into broader defensive doctrine. The afternoon's analysis revealed the full scope of what had been prevented by Sarah's intervention. The 8 F-16 aircraft had been carrying live ordnance for the training exercise, including air-to-air missiles worth hundreds of thousands of dollars each. If the aircraft had been forced to make emergency landings at unknown locations due to fuel exhaustion, the weapons would have required explosive ordnance disposal teams to render them safe, potentially exposing civilian populations to danger. The pilots themselves, representing millions of dollars in training investment and decades of combined experience, would have faced life-threatening situations that could have resulted in casualties, extending far beyond the immediate participants. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had witnessed Sarah's performance throughout the crisis, provided testimony that would become part of her permanent record. Sergeant Chun's actions under pressure demonstrated technical expertise, sound judgment, and professional courage that exemplify the highest standards of military service. When standard procedures proved inadequate for an unprecedented situation, she developed innovative solutions that saved lives and prevented significant loss of military assets. Her performance during this crisis was nothing short of exceptional. The formal recognition process began immediately, with paperwork being prepared for decorations that would acknowledge Sarah's heroism, while maintaining the security classifications that surrounded the incident. The details of the electronic attack remained classified at levels that would prevent public discussion, but Sarah's actions would be documented in military records that would influence her career trajectory for years to come. More importantly, her techniques would be studied, refined, and incorporated into training programs that would prepare future communication specialists for similar threats. As the debriefing sessions concluded and the investigation teams departed for their home stations, Sarah found herself walking across the flight line where the 8 F-16s sat in their parking spots, looking deceptively peaceful in the golden light of late afternoon. The aircraft showed no external signs of the crisis they had endured, their sleek forms reflecting the desert sun with the same metallic gleam they had displayed during the morning's routine pre-flight preparations. But Sarah knew that each pilot who climbed out of those cockpits had experienced something that would remain with them for the rest of their careers. Colonel Wright approached her as she stood near Viper 1, his flight suit still showing the sweat stains that marked the physical stress of flying without instruments for extended periods. His handshake was firm, his expression serious but grateful. "Sergeant Chen, I've been flying F-16s for 15 years, and I've never experienced anything like what happened today. When we lost all navigation and communication systems, I thought we might be facing the end of our flying careers, if not worse. Your voice coming through that emergency transmitter was the most welcome sound I've ever heard in a cockpit." "Major." Adams joined them moments later, her own expression reflecting the mixture of relief and professional respect that followed successful completion of an emergency that could have ended in disaster. "Sergeant Chen, I want you to know that your navigation guidance was accurate to within a quarter mile over a 40-mile dead reckoning flight. That level of precision saved us from what could have been a fuel emergency that forced us to eject. Overpopulated areas, you didn't just guide us home. You prevented a potential civilian disaster." The recognition from the pilots carried weight that extended beyond official decorations or command acknowledgement. These were professionals who understood exactly what Sarah's intervention had meant in terms of flight safety, mission completion, and personal survival. Their gratitude was informed by intimate knowledge of how quickly aviation emergencies could escalate from routine problems to life-threatening crises, and how critical communication and navigation support was to successful resolution of such situations. As the sun began to set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded everyone why the Southwest was considered one of the world's most beautiful landscapes, Sarah reflected on the day's events and their broader implications. The electronic attack had exposed vulnerabilities in military communication, systems that would require years of research and development to address adequately. But it had also demonstrated that human expertise, creativity, and determination could overcome technological challenges that seemed insurmountable when viewed through the lens of standard procedures. The irony was not lost on her that the most sophisticated electronic warfare attack in recent memory had been defeated by equipment that predated modern digital technology and techniques that relied more on fundamental physics than computer algorithms. The legacy analog systems that most operators considered obsolete had proven resistant to jamming techniques designed to defeat state-of-the-art digital communication networks. Her success had come not from having the newest technology but from understanding the oldest principles deeply enough to apply them in innovative ways. The evening brought a different kind of recognition as word of the day's events spread through the unofficial networks that connected military personnel across bases, services, and specialties. Sarah's actions would become part of the folklore that sustained military morale and esprit de corps, joining the stories of individual heroism that reminded service members why their missions mattered and how individual expertise could make the difference between success and failure when stakes were highest. More importantly, the incident would influence training programs, equipment procurement decisions, and operational procedures in ways that would improve military capability for years to come. Sarah's techniques would be analyzed, refined, and taught to future communication specialists who would benefit from her experience, without necessarily understanding how innovative her responses had been. The knowledge she had gained through years of study and practice would become part of institutional memory that would serve the military long after her own career had ended. The transformation in how others viewed Sarah was immediate and lasting. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had supervised her work for months without fully appreciating her capabilities, now sought her input on communication procedures that had previously been considered routine. Captain Stevens included her in planning sessions that had formerly been limited to officers and senior enlisted personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison recommended her for advanced training opportunities that would accelerate her career progression and increase her influence on communication policy and procedures. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah's own understanding of her role and capabilities. The crisis had forced her to move beyond the technical specialist position she had occupied for years, taking on leadership responsibilities that required command presence, strategic thinking, and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. She had discovered that her expertise was not just technical knowledge, but included the judgment and courage necessary to apply that knowledge when conventional wisdom proved inadequate. The broader lessons of the day extended far beyond military communication procedures or electronic warfare doctrine. Sarah's story illustrated how expertise developed through dedication and continuous learning could prove essential when least expected, how individuals working in seemingly routine positions might possess capabilities that became critical during emergencies, and how innovation often emerged from combining established knowledge with creative thinking under pressure. For young people entering technical fields, Sarah's experience demonstrated that mastery required more than following established procedures or operating standard equipment. True expertise involved understanding fundamental principles deeply enough to innovate when circumstances demanded solutions that didn't exist in textbooks or training manuals. It required intellectual curiosity that drove continuous learning even when immediate applications weren't apparent, and professional courage that enabled decisive action when official authority was absent or inadequate. For leaders at all levels, the incident highlighted the importance of recognizing and nurturing expertise that might not be immediately visible through traditional organizational structures. Sarah's capabilities had been present throughout her assignment at Blackwater Air Station, but they had remained largely unrecognized until crisis created conditions that demanded their application. Effective leadership required creating environments where specialized knowledge could be identified, developed, and utilized when needed most. The story also illustrated how technological advancement, while generally beneficial, could create new vulnerabilities that required human expertise to address. The electronic attack had succeeded precisely because it targeted the sophisticated digital systems that had replaced older analog technology. But the solution had come from understanding both old and new approaches well enough to combine them effectively. Progress required maintaining knowledge of fundamental principles, even as new techniques were developed and implemented. As Sarah finally made her way back to her quarters late that evening, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that her years of preparation had proven worthwhile when tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. 8 pilots were safe, 8 aircraft had been recovered without damage, and military communication procedures would be improved based on lessons learned from her innovative response to an unprecedented threat. The radio equipment that had been her domain for so many years would continue operating with the same electronic precision that characterized all modern military technology. But the human expertise that made that technology effective in the face of unexpected challenges would be viewed with new appreciation and respect. Sarah's story would serve as a reminder that in an age of increasing technological sophistication, the wisdom, creativity, and courage of individual operators remained the most important factors in determining success or failure when circumstances pushed systems beyond their designed capabilities. The legacy of that morning would live on in the procedures, training programs, and institutional knowledge that would prepare future military personnel for challenges that hadn't yet been imagined. And somewhere in that legacy would be the understanding that expertise developed through dedication and curiosity, applied with courage and innovation when crisis demanded nothing less than perfection, could make the difference between disaster and triumph when the stakes were measured in human lives and national security. 2 years had passed since that fateful morning at Blackwater Air Station, and Sarah Chun stood before a wall of commendations in her new office at the Pentagon, each certificate and medal representing a journey that had transformed not just her own career, but the entire approach to electronic warfare defense across the American military. The morning sunlight streaming through her window illuminated the distinguished service, medal that hung prominently among the award's recognition for actions that had saved 8 lives and revolutionized military communication doctrine. The office itself was a testament to how completely her role had evolved. Where once she had monitored routine radio traffic from a corner workstation, she now occupied a space that served as the nerve center for the Department of Defense's Electronic Warfare Countermeasures Division. Banks of secure computers displayed real-time threat assessments from military installations worldwide, while classified communication systems connected her to specialists and commanders across the globe who relied on her expertise to counter increasingly sophisticated electronic attacks. Sarah's official title was now Senior Technical Advisor for Communication Security, a position that had been created specifically to institutionalize the innovative thinking that had proven so crucial during the Blackwater crisis. Her responsibilities extended far beyond any single base or operation, encompassing the development of defensive strategies that would protect American military forces against electronic warfare threats that were evolving faster than traditional defense planning could anticipate. The transformation had not been without challenges. The weight of responsibility for national security communications fell heavily on someone who had begun her career as a routine radio operator, and the classified nature of her work created isolation that was both professionally necessary and personally demanding. But Sarah had found purpose in knowing that her expertise was protecting American service members and advancing capabilities that would serve the nation for decades to come. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had witnessed Sarah's heroic actions firsthand, visited her Pentagon office during the trip to Washington for his own promotion ceremony. His presence brought back memories of that chaotic morning when split-second decisions had meant the difference between disaster and survival. "Sergeant Chun," he said, using her former rank out of habit before correcting himself. "Dr. Chun, I still can't believe how completely everything changed from that one morning." Sarah had indeed completed her doctorate in electromagnetic engineering through an accelerated program designed for military specialists whose practical experience exceeded their formal academic credentials. The dissertation she had written on adaptive communication protocols for electronic warfare environments had become required reading at military academies and defense contractor research facilities worldwide. Her academic achievement represented the formalization of knowledge that had been tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The pilots whose lives she had saved maintained contact through annual reunions that brought together everyone who had been present during the Blackwater incident. General Wright, now commanding a major air combat unit, never failed to acknowledge how Sarah's expertise had influenced his understanding of electronic warfare's impact on aviation operations. Major Adams, promoted to colonel and serving as the Air Force's senior expert on combat communication, frequently consulted with Sarah on developing tactics that would enable aircraft to operate effectively despite sophisticated jamming. "Every time we conduct electronic warfare training," Colonel Adams explained during their most recent meeting, "we reference the techniques you developed that morning. Your innovations have become standard procedure for situations that we hope never to encounter again, but for which we must be prepared. The knowledge you applied during those critical minutes has literally been encoded into our institutional memory." The training programs that Sarah had helped establish were now graduating hundreds of communication specialists annually, each equipped with knowledge and skills that traced their origins to her emergency innovations. The multiplication of expertise that had begun with one person's response to the crisis was creating a distributed capability that made American military forces more resilient against electronic warfare attacks. Former students of her courses were now serving as instructors themselves, ensuring that the lessons of Blackwater would be transmitted to future generations of specialists. Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of Sarah's most successful students, had recently returned from a deployment where her unit had successfully maintained Communication during an electronic attack that was even more sophisticated than the one that had targeted Blackwater. Her after-action report credited the training she had received from Sarah with enabling her team to adapt their equipment and procedures quickly enough to maintain operational effectiveness despite comprehensive jamming. The principles you taught us about understanding our equipment well enough to modify it when necessary literally saved our mission, Captain Walsh wrote in a letter that now occupied a place of honor in Sarah's office. When standard procedures failed, we were able to innovate solutions that enabled us to complete our objectives. The confidence to attempt those modifications came directly from the training you provided and the example you set during the Blackwater incident. The technological innovations that had emerged from analyzing Sarah's emergency modifications were now being fielded in communication systems that served military forces worldwide. Equipment manufacturers had invested billions of dollars in developing technologies that combined digital sophistication with electromagnetic warfare resistance, creating hybrid systems that could maintain effectiveness under attack conditions. That would have completely disabled earlier generations of military communication equipment. Dr. Amanda Richardson, who had led the initial investigation into the Blackwater attack, now served as Sarah's primary liaison with the intelligence community. Their collaboration ensured that defensive innovations remained ahead of evolving threats, incorporating intelligence about adversary capabilities into research that would create countermeasures before new attacks could be launched. The partnership represented the kind of cooperation between operational specialists and intelligence analysts that was essential for maintaining American advantages in electronic warfare. The Blackwater incident taught us that our adversaries' capabilities were more advanced than our threat assessments had indicated. Dr. Richardson reflected during a classified briefing that brought together senior officials from across the defense and intelligence communities. But it also demonstrated that American innovation and expertise could overcome technological disadvantages when applied with sufficient creativity and courage. Our current research programs are designed to institutionalize that kind of innovative thinking so that future crises can be met with systematic responses rather than individual heroism. The electromagnetic warfare threat had continued to evolve since the Blackwater attack, with intelligence reports indicating that potential adversaries were developing even more sophisticated capabilities. But American defensive responses had evolved as well, incorporating lessons learned from Sarah's crisis response into systematic approaches that could counter threats before they achieved their objectives. The technological competition between offensive and defensive electronic warfare capabilities had intensified. But American forces were better prepared for that competition because of innovations that traced their origins to 30 minutes of emergency problem solving. Sarah's influence extended beyond military applications to civilian sectors where electronic warfare threats were becoming increasingly relevant. Critical infrastructure protection, civilian aviation security, and emergency communication networks were all benefiting from defensive concepts that had emerged from analysis of the Blackwater incident. The principles of adaptive response to electronic attack that Sarah had demonstrated were being incorporated into systems that protected civilian as well as military interests. The personal cost of Sarah's transformation had been significant. The classified nature of her work limited her ability to share her experiences with family and friends who couldn't understand why she couldn't discuss what she did for a living. The weight of responsibility for national security communications created stress that required constant management, and the knowledge of threats that most people never considered made it difficult to enjoy the simple pleasures of civilian life. But Sarah found compensation in the knowledge that her expertise was protecting people who would never know her name or understand how their security depended on the work she and her colleagues performed in classified facilities around the world. The radio operator who had once been nearly invisible in a control tower had become a guardian whose vigilance helped ensure that American military forces could communicate effectively, no matter what obstacles their adversaries might place in their path. The legacy of the Blackwater incident would continue long after Sarah's own career ended. The students she had trained would train others. The technology she had helped develop would be enhanced by future researchers, and the procedures she had created would be adapted for threats that had not yet emerged. The knowledge that had been tested during 30 minutes of crisis would serve American interests for generations to come. As Sarah looked out her Pentagon window at the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., she understood that her story represented something larger than individual achievement or professional success. It illustrated the potential that existed within every person who dedicated themselves to mastering their chosen field, who continued learning even when immediate applications weren't apparent, and who possessed the courage to act decisively when their expertise became essential for protecting others. The quiet radio operator, who had once monitored routine communications, had become a voice that influenced American defense policy at the highest levels. Her journey from overlooked specialist to recognized expert demonstrated that preparation, knowledge, and courage could combine to create extraordinary impact when circumstances demanded innovation beyond established procedures. In the end, Sarah Chun's story was about more than electronic warfare or military aviation. It was about the transformative power of expertise applied with creativity and courage during moments of crisis. It was about the potential for individual knowledge to influence outcomes that affected thousands of people, and about the responsibility that came with possessing capabilities that others depended on for their safety and success. The electromagnetic spectrum that had been her domain for so many years continued to carry the voices of pilots, controllers, and commanders whose safety depended on communication systems that incorporated innovations derived from her emergency response. Every successful mission that was completed, despite electronic warfare attacks, every pilot who was guided safely home despite jamming that would have been catastrophic just a few years earlier, and every crisis that was resolved through adaptive communication techniques represented part of Sarah's continuing legacy. Her story would live on in the doctrine that guided electronic warfare defense, in the training that prepared specialists for unprecedented challenges, and in the example of how individual expertise could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles when applied with sufficient knowledge and courage. The radio operator who had spoken when others were silent, who had innovated when others followed procedures, and who had succeeded when failure seemed inevitable, had created a legacy that would protect American interests for decades to come. The lessons of Blackwater Air Station would continue to inspire future generations of specialists who might find themselves facing crises that required them to move beyond established procedures to develop solutions that could mean the difference between success and failure. Sarah's example reminded them that expertise was not just about knowing how to operate equipment, but about understanding principles deeply enough to innovate when innovation was the only path to success. And in that understanding, in that preparation for challenges that might never come, but could prove critical if they did, lay the true measure of Sarah Chun's contribution to American security and the lasting impact of 30 minutes that had changed not just her own life, but the capability of the nation she had sworn to serve and protect. The legacy lives on, carried forward by those who understand that true expertise means being ready for the moment when knowledge, creativity, and courage converge to protect what matters most. In that readiness, in that dedication to continuous learning and innovative thinking, Sarah Chun's story continues to unfold through every specialist who follows her example and every crisis that is resolved through the principles she helped establish. Her name may never be widely known, her contributions may remain classified, but her impact on American military capability and the safety of those who serve will endure as long as electromagnetic waves carry the voices of those who depend on communication for their survival and success. In the quiet heroism of preparation, Meeting opportunity, in the triumph of knowledge over technology, in the victory of innovation over adversity, Sarah Chun's legacy lives on. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.